strategic plan of developing a new strategic plan. So we are really thrilled to have plucked you away from this important moment in your life and career and the career of the Global Compact. And while she was in the taxi, I could see that she was still talking with her colleagues. And she had to tell them, just give me 10 minutes while I get off the taxi, and then the next hour I'm going to be off because I'm going to have my own presentation. But thank you again, Ursula. And really the guiding principles on business and human rights is one of the most important declarations. It derives its human rights agenda from the existing treaties and the treaty body jurisprudence. And the Global Compact is the most important institution to hold businesses and governments accountable to the UN guiding principles. So we developed this conversation on two major pillars. One is that Ursula will talk to us about her own journey as a human rights advocate and the ways in which she played this pioneering role in developing the Global Compact. And then we have her engage in conversation with our own Penn Law student, Maura Douglas, who as a 1L worked with the Institute for Human Rights and Business in London. And I'm so proud that her supervisors came back to me with rave reviews of her work and her vision and the ways in which she helped to really shape their agenda. The Human Rights and Business Institute is the leading international think tank on business and human rights, situated in London, but with offices in Myanmar, in Colombia, and in Kenya. And I'm very proud to have helped to place Maura with the Institute. So it makes me feel really proud when our Penn Law students really shine on the global stage. So thank you, Maura, for the work that you did over the summer. And so she will engage with Ursula because she comes to this with this kind of renewed sense of urgency, but also with the work that she's done in the summer with really provocative questions and challenges. What does human rights in business mean? You know, I just had a conversation before coming to this meeting with the head of the Global Program Against Torture in Geneva. And then when I told him that we will be hosting this conversation, he said, so what do you really think of businesses and human rights? What do you really think the difference that they make? So I said, well, we had to wait and see and how this conversation evolves. So there is a lot of skepticism, I have to say, from these traditional human rights partners, traditional groups that have spent many generations working on the human rights agenda, who we used to see businesses as the enemy, and that now you see the businesses sitting at the same table advancing the human rights agenda. How do the two come together? And as I told him, our students are the next generation of leaders, both in human rights and in business. You are going to be the movers and shakers in business and human rights. So it is your charge to make sure that you speak to each other and listen to each other, and you promote human rights in everything you do, including in the businesses and corporations that you will lead. So thank you very much, Ursula, for being with us today. And thank you, Maura, for moderating this conversation. And Caroline, thank you for organizing this.
Great. So, Ursula, why don't we just start with the basics? Can you give us an understanding of what the initiative is actually doing and what the need was that it was responding to on the international space?
Sure. So can you hear me? Yeah? So yeah, the Global Compact is, as you were just hearing, we just actually passed our 16-year anniversary, but the context in which it was actually created was a rising sense among many in the world that globalization wasn't delivering for a lot of the world's people. And back in 1999, there were protests in the context, for instance, of the World Trade Organization. And there was really this feeling that globalization, this process has totally gone off the rails. And the prospect actually was a complete reversal, increased protectionism, shutting down of opportunities. And a lot of people were worried. Governments were worried. Businesses were worried, civil society were worried. So this was the kind of context, actually, where at the World Economic Forum the former Secretary General Kofi Annan, he was giving a speech. And actually at the time it was just intended to be a speech. And he hoped that then others would take up this kind of call and in their various work, and then that would be it from his side in a way. But so he gave this speech where he called on businesses around the world to give globalization a human face, to drawing on international conventions and declarations that governments had already agreed to, so the norms were really sound and universal, and to orient them towards businesses. So he made a very specific call to businesses, and the actual call there in terms of the principles that he outlined are to this day the core of the Global Compact. So after he gave this speech, the response from business, from governments, from civil society was overwhelming, and they said, this can't just be a speech. You have to make this into an operational initiative. So then he spent with his team the next year, obviously he had a lot else on his plate, but creating this initiative, the Global Compact. So it was born 1 year later in 2000.
Great. And can you talk a little bit about your work in the legal and governance sphere?
Sure. So I'm the Chief of Social Sustainability, Governance and Legal. So what that means is all of our work, we call it issue work, engaging companies on how, for instance, do you implement human rights? How do you, as a company in your workplace, marketplace and community, implement gender equality? What do you do about climate change? What should companies' role and response be? Issues of water, etc. Like all of the different themes within corporate sustainability, the Global Compact does work around engaging companies, learning, dialogue, events, etc. And so in my team, we look after anything to do with people, basically. So human rights, women's empowerment, children's rights, trafficking, labour, those kinds of issues. And then on the governance side, it encompasses anti-corruption, rule of law, and business for peace. And then, of course, we look after legal affairs in my team as well. So just the classic in-house legal function.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just to be clear again, the UN Global Compact is not an enforcement agency or a regulatory agency.
I actually like to say, because some people say Global Compact doesn't have teeth, and I like to say we are a guide dog rather than a guard dog, because our role is not to, we're a voluntary initiative. It's sitting inside the United Nations. You can probably imagine how governments would feel if UN civil servants started saying good company, bad company, good company about their own companies in their country. And in fact, Rangita, you mentioned the 1970s, and there was a predecessor entity that was created, the Centre on Transnational Corporations, and they developed a code of conduct, and governments shut it down. So it was a very contentious space that the Secretary General was entering again in 1999 with this speech. But because times had really changed, the different actors, including governments this time, realised that something needed to be done. And so that's why, obviously the Global Compact is not a silver bullet, but it is one element that was created to advance within the UN context concern about these issues and getting companies engaged on these issues.
Okay. So as a law student, I know at least for me, I wanted to think about, okay, these principles sound fantastic, but how are they enforced? How are businesses held accountable? So can you talk a little bit about first how you incentivize businesses to really follow these principles as opposed to just having them be an ideal standard? Mm-hmm. And then also if businesses aren't following those principles, how you may hold them accountable or recommend them to be held accountable.
Sure. So to get engaged in the Global Compact in the first place, a company sends a letter signed by their own CEO, endorsed by their board, so they have to actually have a conversation about it, make it sure it's a serious commitment. Then they send it to our CEO, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and that then is public, including their letter. So already, even from that, there's a tool there that different stakeholders, whether they're inside the company, maybe working on these issues, or protagonists, can use to say, hey, company, you've signed up to these principles. What are you doing about X, Y, Z? And I know for a fact that's the reason why some companies don't sign, because they're worried that that then will indeed empower and equip their critics with ammunition against them. In addition, as part of being a participant, you have to communicate your progress on an annual basis to your own stakeholders. So that's a report that every company has to do. And for transparency purposes, they have to submit a link to that to our website. And if they don't do it, or if according to a questionnaire it doesn't meet the minimum requirements, they actually get an icon next to their name which says that they are not communicating. And that's then another opportunity for different stakeholders to raise issues, for media to ask questions, etc. And if they are trying to hold themselves out as having a good reputation, that is a kind of a negative marker. But at the same time, a UN initiative is indicating that you're not communicating about these kinds of issues. If after 1 year after you were due to communicate, you haven't communicated, you're kicked out. And we've kicked out 4,000 companies in the last decade. So, it's for a variety of reasons, but mostly it's because they haven't done this, annual report to their own stakeholders on how they're doing. So they're our main kind of elements in terms of the actual components. There's one other, which is we have a complaint process, which is called dialogue facilitation. And so people can raise a concern with us, and we can engage the company and the complainant in dialogue around the topic. And similarly, if they don't do that, they get that icon next to their name, and we can delist them. And if there's an admission of guilt or a finding of a competent body, we can also delist them. So they're the main mechanisms that we have in place. So while we're a voluntary initiative, it's voluntary to come in the door, but once you're in the door, there are some requirements that you must meet, and if you don't, then you'll be expelled, and we reserve the right to publish their name, and do. So
that's really interesting. I didn't know that. And then in terms of these 4,000 companies that you've kicked out, is there anything within the initiative, any efforts to try to get them back in, or is it more just kind of holding them accountable publicly?
Well, the interesting thing is if you actually Google some of these companies, one of the first results that come up is that they were delisted from the Global Compact. So it's a gift that keeps on giving. But the kinds of, if they were delisted because they didn't communicate progress, well then we don't necessarily want them in the initiative. So they can come back to us, and there is a process for that, whereby they then have to submit their communication on progress up front before they could be readmitted. So they don't get a free pass of a year before it would be due. So that's kind of the main way. Sometimes it happens, but I think they had that opportunity, and then also during that year after it was due and now they have that icon, we engage intensely with them because we don't want to lose them, because once they're out the door, it's hard for us we've lost that opportunity to engage with them. So it is a loss. We're not happy about the fact that they're gone, but we really did give them a chance. We tried. And they're out the door, so they have to. If they come back, they need to be able to show that they this time are going to take it more seriously.
Okay, and just for comparison, 4,000 have been kicked out. How many are still within the global?
Oh, good point. We have 13,000 signatories, of which 9,000 are companies.
Okay, great.
So 4,000 is not insignificant.
No, it's not. But 13,000 isn't either, so
Yes.
that's good. So I want to go back to some of the specifics of the principles. Can you just kind of lay those out a little bit, maybe why you picked them, and then also maybe examples of success underneath specific ones?
Sure. So the principles were chosen by former Secretary General Kofi Annan and his team at the time. What they did is they looked at international instruments, these conventions and declarations, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work, or the Rio Declaration. And subsequently, when the UN Convention Against Corruption was adopted and ratified, a principle on anti-corruption was added. So that's where the 10 principles come from, and they were selected at that time, and this is actually what the Secretary General at the time included in his speech, because he felt these were the areas where companies were having the most potential negative impacts or actual, and where they had the most potential to have a positive impact. So that's how these principles were selected. In terms of some examples of the kinds of things we do, so one of the key things that we've done is, in the same way that we kind of pioneered, the idea of engaging businesses on principles, normative UN agenda, we've actually taken other conventions and declarations and normative agendas in the UN and oriented them to business too. So an example, for instance, is the Women's Empowerment Principles, which over now 1,300 CEOs have made a commitment to. And they themselves a set of 7 principles across workplace, marketplace and community on what companies concretely can do to help achieve gender equality and women's empowerment. And of course, they deal both with what companies shouldn't do, the potential harm they may be causing, and also what the potential is, whether it's, for instance, as an example, through their value chain, by making sure that they're sourcing as well from equal opportunity sourcing from women vendors and not just male-owned businesses. And we similarly collaborated with, that was done with the UN's gender entity UN Women, and we similarly collaborated with UNICEF and Save the Children to develop a set of principles, the children's rights and business principles. And so basically what these kinds of initiatives do, and we have a number of them, is they give a different lens to corporate sustainability. And, for instance, say from the gender perspective or from the children's perspective. And as a result of getting more specific, they help companies understand more concretely what they need to do and what they can do to advance that specific issue. And why that's important, as an example on gender equality, there was an interesting study that was done by KPMG in the UK, and they interviewed all these CEOs, and they asked them about their current status of how they felt they were doing on gender equality. And a few things kind of emerged. One was, the vast majority of these CEOs recognise that having, including in their workforce, closer gender balance was actually a really important strategic priority. And we know there's so much research, right, that shows that if you have a diverse workforce, you're going to be more successful and more financially successful as well. But they found that many of these CEOs had pioneered various initiatives on, say, gender equality, whether it was in the workplace or an affinity group or whatever it was. But they also found they were really dissatisfied that their initiatives they'd taken to date had not been successful enough. Maybe they'd moved the needle a little bit, but they were still really far from gender parity, particularly, for instance, at their upper levels. But then here's the good news: they recognised that they weren't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They recognised that this was still a really important strategic priority. So they wanted new approaches. And so, for instance, what these women's empowerment principles do is they take a systematic approach. It's not enough to have a program here and a program there. It's half-hearted. You need to take a systematic approach, and you need to look at your workplace, marketplace, and community. And you need to look at issues like unconscious bias, for instance. And you need to look at your sourcing practices and see, do you have equal opportunity sourcing from women-owned businesses as well as male-owned businesses? And all of these kinds of things. And then if you take that systematic approach, that's how you can move the needle. Just a few isolated programs are not going to do it. So that this notion of taking a systematic, comprehensive viewpoint underpins a lot of our work across the different issues.
And so if I'm understanding this, I'm hearing a lot about different collaborations, different priorities, different principles, gender equality, thinking about, in Europe, the 2020 Women on Boards initiative and things of that nature. Where's the law's place in this? I mean, at what point do there need to be clear enforcement mechanisms for certain abuses specifically done by businesses?
The law is really crucial, actually, and I'd say one of the issues and kind of even points of resistance when the Global Compact and, say, other voluntary initiatives kind of got started, 16 years ago, was this strong belief that there was a dichotomy between the voluntary initiatives and the law. And I think what we've found in more recent years is that pretty much every actor, including most major civil society organisations, have recognised that actually there's not a dichotomy. And if you pick any issue, maybe it's illicit drug use, etc., you have a smart mix of approaches. You may have learning programs. Sure, you may have crimes and a criminal law approach, but you have everything in between. And it's the same for any of these complex corporate sustainability themes too. We really need to have a mix of approaches. And so I think that the law is really, really crucial. But in and of itself, often it's not going to be enough. That's what we find. So we're not, in no way, shape or form, are we anti-law. Actually, it's the opposite. We see law as having a really crucial role. But we do think that in so many instances, whether, for instance, it's child labour, which is prohibited in most countries around the world, and yet it's still, prevalent, whatever the issue is, we need, in addition to law, we need other measures that, among other things, can help do things like close knowledge gaps, understand how you actually do it, or that can work in conjunction with legal approaches. So there's also a lot of things in the positive space. So beyond avoiding harm, which, laws are more in that space. There's a lot that we feel that companies can do, and we want to encourage companies to do to have positive impacts in any of these areas. And the law is never going to mandate these positive approaches. There's so many dilemmas that come up. Coming back to child labour, for instance, what do you do if you find that in your supply chain you have children working? Like, obviously you can't continue in that situation, but at the same time, if you just, let the children out in the street, that's not going to work either. So there's a whole lot of other kind of complex steps and approaches and, engagement with other entities that needs to take place. And that's the kind of thing often that, law is not going to help you with. So you need this combination of law and other approaches to be able to address these issues.
Yeah, I think that's great. So you just mentioned you celebrated your 16-year anniversary, so congratulations for that.
Thank you. We're a teenager.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe what you think the shift is going to be in the next, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years? Because I think the state of play for transnational corporations is changing and will continue to change. So can you talk about what the global compact's role is in that and where you see any shifts happening in the future?
Well, something really very much connected with this, and maybe many of you are aware, something really, really big happened last September at the United Nations. Does anyone here know what that is? Want to take a guess?
I mentioned that.
The Sustainable Development Goals, so this whole Agenda 2030. So that has been really big for us because I think now it's fair to say that sustainability, we can see the trajectory, it is here to stay. This is not some trend, this is not some fad that's going away. So, and it's one of the things actually, if people recall what happened with Volkswagen last year, where it turned out that they had this terrible emission scandal, which just really racks the brain because, given we can see where things are going, the key question left now for any company, I think, is when are they going to adapt and what position do they want to take? Do they want to be a leader in this? Or are they going to wait to kind of be done to, among other things, by, say, regulators, etc.? And that's going to be really challenging for their business if they're not prepared. So I think these Sustainable Development Goals, which actually map exactly to the time horizon that you mentioned, 15 years, are definitely really critical. And so one of the things we've been doing at the Global Compact now is kind of orienting ourselves to look at business engagement on the Sustainable Development Goals, not just to see what companies need to do to make sure that they are acting responsibly and therefore not undermining this development agenda, but also what are they doing so they can actually have a positive impact on it. Not just as a matter of charity, although charity can be great, but even there are business opportunities, right? Like in all the different gaps that are identified where there's going to be different resources coming from, among others, from governments, etc. There'll be so much more focus. They can identify the business opportunities there. And so it's actually, there's a strong business case for companies to engage on the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And then I think another key piece as well is around the role of business in advocacy. And, that can be kind of fraught with challenges, and there has to be criteria around how companies can legitimately do that. But at the same time, for instance, in this country, we've seen some examples recently of the impact that companies can have when they speak out in support of human rights norms. So I think there's a potential for companies to play more of that. Of course, not every company, but for some companies to play this more statesperson type role where they can actually help society, including for their own business benefit, right? Because businesses are also disadvantaged. If population is uneducated, if their occupational health and safety rules are not in place and enforced, if there's conflict, if climate change, all of these things also add cost to business and they add instability. And companies don't, they may be risk takers, but not that much risk. And so we like to actually usually describe sort of as two concentric circles which overlap in the middle. So you've got business interest and UN interest, or you could say global interest, and they're not the same, but there's a core in the middle where they can agree, that's where there's a lot of opportunity for partnership and collaboration.
Great. Well, I want to make sure there's some time for our audience questions, so I'm going to pass it over to Caroline to ask a few questions, but thank you so much, Ursula.
Thank you so very much for coming. I just have a few career-related questions. Your audience is primarily JDs as well as LLM students, and I thought it was so fantastic that you also had an LLM, and you received your law degree from the University of Columbia. Actually, from Columbia Law School, your LLM, but also from the Nash Law School in Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about your career path? I think a lot of people would love to have your career, so it'd be nice to know how you got to this point.
Sure. So I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer, so I couldn't wait to go to law school. And then after that, and in Australia you go to law school straight, well at that time anyway, straight from high school. And I always wanted to do public interest and human rights. So after law school, I worked at our government human rights agency, which is basically does equal opportunity and anti-discrimination complaints, etc. So I worked there for a couple of years. But in Australia, or at least in my state, to become a lawyer, you either have to go to a school for an additional year, or you can do an apprenticeship for a year. So I thought, oh, I'll do an apprenticeship because then instead of I paying, they pay me, which of course, you know, is a relevant consideration, right, given cost of education. So I did that for a couple of years, and while I was there, I found that you could do these internships at the United Nations. So I had been doing, and as was the case at the time in Australia, it used to be that actually tertiary education was free, believe it or not, but then they started, my first year, they started adding fees and it went up and up and up. But if you were still enrolled, you could do an internship at the United Nations. So I took some time off from the law firm I was working at, came to the United Nations, did an internship, and sort of fell in love with New York, and so only went back to Melbourne, where I'm from, for a month. And then I moved back, but I didn't go straight back to the UN because, interestingly, the impression I got, I worked in the legal affairs section, the impression I got was, wow, there's a lot of people here who are really talented, who are doing jobs that they don't need to have those qualifications quite to do. So I was a bit discouraged, to be honest, but I formed the view that it might be better to come in later on in your career. And so that was kind of my aim. And in the interim, I then worked with a law firm in San Francisco, once again doing equal opportunity and anti-discrimination law. And so I was very focused on the domestic, and I wanted to go to the international. And so I felt, what could help me do that? And I felt that an LLM would help me do that, particularly one where I could, you know, meet a lot of interesting people who'd come and give brown bags and stuff like that, and who'd come to class and you know, and a lot of adjunct professors. I took all the classes with the adjunct professors because I wanted to meet a lot of practitioners, and I took all the classes like clinics and where you could do a case study or things like that, because I wanted really to, I had that key objective of making that transition to the global. And at that point, the Global Compact had only just been born, and the executive director at the time came and spoke to the class I was taking on business and human rights. And so I just said, I have to do a paper for this class. Can I do it as research for you? And he was like, oh, great, yes, sure. So that kind of then rolled into, there was an opportunity for a part-time job. So then that then rolled into, after a period of a year, a full-time job. And basically, I've been there ever since. And right when it was still part-time, I worked at the OECD in Paris on their corporate responsibility initiative. So I think a key message I would have is persistence. Like, once you know what you really want to do, you know, just try every which way. Meet everyone you can. Like, if you really, really want to do that thing, you know, don't give up on that. It can be really hard sometimes to get, for instance, into the UN. But if you really, really want it, just, you know, work at it. Just don't give up. Sometimes, you know, you may have to get around this way, but I know so many people, for instance, at the UN who have stories like that, who were just really determined. And you know, I think so often when you look back at your career, it seems so linear, but the experience of living it, and you always hear this, is that's not how it is. People, they would never have known, like, you know, say 2 years from then, that's what they would be doing. So instead, it's much more like this. And of course, when you look back, it all seems coherent and makes sense, right? I know when I look at someone's bio, I'm like, oh, but that just makes so much sense. But at the time, they often had no idea. And so I think one other thing that I take from that is that any one step you make, it may feel momentous, but you can take some pressure off yourself, because that one step is actually not as momentous as it feels at that time, because there are many, many different steps. And the key thing is, if you know what you love and what your values are, you will find a way to work in that dimension. And it may not have been how you thought about it originally, but it will work. And so I think definitely having, you know, the kind of passion and commitment, and just reminding yourself of your objectives, and really just meeting everyone you can, you know, it really can work. So never give up on your dreams.
The thing with what you just said is networking, and it seems like you really took advantage of networking while you were at school, seeking out certain classes, seeking out opportunities to meet people. Now that you're in the field, are there any organizations that you think, oh, if they have student memberships, perhaps the students should get involved in there as well to meet people?
Yeah, I think definitely the networking part. I mean, one hears this again and again, but it's so true. And I think also, you know, the idea of networking as actually building genuine relationships is particularly key. It's not just about how many people you know, but it's actually about building genuine rapport with people. And so I think just having chats, basically just having chats with people, you know, any people that you meet. And I think when you are in law school, whether you're doing a JD or LM, you have such, and particularly at an incredible law school like this, you have such an amazing opportunity to meet so many different people. And if they're working in a field that interests you, just, you know, strike up a chat with them. You know, people, I think on the whole, like, there will always be some people who won't respond to your email, but don't be discouraged by that, because maybe they just have a lot of email. But just keep trying. And I think, you know, the other thing is, these days as well, is such an opportunity, whether it's through blogs or otherwise, if you're really interested, to kind of share what you think on the topic, to, you know, if you have to write papers, you can write them on the theme. I think in terms of organizations to join, yeah, I would say things like LinkedIn are so critical. Like, I mean, and this probably will laugh, because I mean, I was only got on LinkedIn like 2 years ago, and so I was like the last person on earth. But it came to light to me because a couple of opportunities specifically. One is that, so I'm a trustee at this endowment at Columbia Law School, and you know how they found me? I think they were literally looking on LinkedIn to see who's in New York who has a job that might be relevant to our area, and who's a graduate of Columbia. Like, that's literally what happened. So I definitely think, and no doubt, you know, I'm preaching to the converted here, but those kind of things and profiles and what your, you know, web sort of presence is are really crucial. And then another one is just classically, I hear from people all the time that if they're looking for speakers for something, they may be looking around on LinkedIn, etc. So, or they hear of someone and then they go to LinkedIn and look them up. So, not to be an advert for LinkedIn, I realize I sound like that. I know there's probably these days a gazillion other things which are so much better. But things like that, you know, it's the virtual connections too. You don't even necessarily have to meet someone virtually. Just if someone is doing something cool, just like reach out to them. I make a concerted effort, because I remember how hard it was and frustrating when I emailed someone and they didn't email me back. So I really try to email everyone back, even if I have to do it like late at night. I think we kind of, you know, owe it to each other. And I think, you know, particularly in international affairs space, which can be sometimes a bit hard to crack into, but definitely, as with anything, it's about, you know, connecting with people, so that if something comes up, for instance, they'll be like, oh, I know someone who'd be good for that, and then they can, you know, give your name, etc.
Wonderful. We are establishing with you the Memorandum of Understanding. So we're hoping that we're going to get really wonderful students to engage with your organization. In particular, if you were looking at someone's application for a summer fellowship at your organization, or perhaps in the future a full-time position at your organization, are there any particular qualities or traits that you would seek in that resume or in that person?
I think the most important thing, two most important things. One is the communication skills. So is the letter well written? Does it have typos, etc.? I mean, it sounds basic, but because a lot of what we do, since we're sitting in New York and our participants are all over the world, is about communication. So I want to know, can someone write well? And often we'll ask for a writing sample, for instance, so we can see how a person writes, the way they argue, etc. And then the second thing is just certainly an interest in the subject matter, but actually the main second thing I'd say is, do they care? Like, do they want to do a good job? Because so often, like, someone can have this great resume, but if they don't actually care about doing a good job, things may not get done, or they don't get done on time, or things fall between the cracks. So that kind of drive and basically giving a damn, but really wanting to do a good job is crucial, I'd say.
It's that passion that you spoke of, right? That you yourself embodied, that's what really propelled you to the top, from someone who took the risk of speaking with the speaker in your law school classroom to someone who is really now the one who is leading the sustainability, legal, and gender equality portfolio at this organization. So I think that says a lot to just that kind of tenacity and passion.
I think they kind of go hand in hand as well, because I mean some people just inherently love like networking, connecting with people. I'm not one of those people. But so if you're not one of those people, if it's about something that you really are passionate about and care about, you just can kind of overcome your natural kind of exactly. And also if you have a genuine interest and you're building genuine relationships, that also makes it easier, because you're not seeing people in an instrumental way. You're genuinely interested in them, in their path, in what they do, and that just makes it a lot easier too. You don't even think about it. It's not networking in that context.
Which is wonderful to tell the students, because that's one of the feedback I always get from students, that I'm not good at networking. I don't like networking. I don't really want to talk to people and reach out because they're going to just shut me down or not respond. But you do have to go out on a limb to reach out to people and to talk to them, and it's so worth it. I'm not so sure if Ricky, do you have any other questions? If not, then we'll open it up for the students to ask. Now's your opportunity.
I just have a question about, I was thinking about like the Modern Slavery Act that came out in the UK and the SEC regulation that has disclosure requirements around conflict minerals, and people have been sort of championing those as national initiatives that have teeth. And then there's also like Habitat 3 going on, which sort of emphasizes this right to the city and making sure that cities are accountable for sustainable development. I'm just wondering, it seems like those on top of, so I guess Habitat 3 on top of the SDGs and then these national regulations, what are some ways that the UN Global Compact is trying to sort of collaborate or streamline all those efforts to make sure that you're being most effective?
Yeah, so one of the things we do is we've done some webinars for companies around, for instance, around the Modern Slavery Act and implications, and I think some of those developments are also really helpful because of this complementarity between regulatory and voluntary. So it helps give additional impetus, and it also means that, for maybe in some companies, for among the first time, they're now like in-house counsel is interested in some of these issues. So we actually have this whole other initiative within the Global Compact on engaging the legal profession, and that includes in-house counsel. We produced this guide called Guide for General Counsel on Corporate Sustainability, and definitely developments like that are really helpful because now these things are kind of crossing their desk, and they have something in the legal space that then gives them an entry point on sustainability more generally. So that's one key way where we follow these developments and bring them to our participants through things like webinars, etc. But we also have country networks in about 85 countries around the world. So when it comes to specific national legislation, that's more something our country networks, for instance, our one here in the US or in the UK, are working on. And they even established in the UK a working group on modern slavery. So they could really look in more depth at how to not only comply, but once they knew about the issues, to actually work on them.
Yeah, it was actually a similar question. It was about the Sustainable Development Goals have really proliferated in terms of the metrics that they're looking at. I think there's 169 now metrics. I'm curious how you interact with the opportunity and challenges of a really proliferation of goals that the UN has, as opposed to, say, Millennium Development Goals, which are much more narrow and focused.
Sure, exactly. Well, one of the things which I think is so remarkable about the SDGs, because on the whole, you're right, like 17 goals, 169 targets, it seems overwhelming, but then on the other hand, so amazing that it could result from or you could get support of 193 governments, and also with all the business engagement and civil society engagement. So in that context, it's amazing that there's not 50 or 100 goals, really. And then I think they are kind of a unifying agenda, because they do bring in so many different dimensions, whether it's climate, even some of the humanitarian aspects, development more generally. So the agenda itself is proving, I think, even more than I anticipated, to be a huge kind of driver of a lot of work across a lot of different UN entities. So it having this unifying dimension to it. And in fact, and it also follows from the fact that so many of the SDGs are really interdependent. You know, like how can you have, if you've got, for instance, in Goal 16, if you've got a lot of corruption and conflict, it's going to be so hard for you to achieve so many of the other goals. So the Deputy Secretary General has this nice phrase, which I like a lot, which is, he calls it a declaration of interdependence. And I think that applies not just to the goals, but also to what we'll need to realize them, in terms of we need governments and business and civil society and academia, etc., collaborating in new and different ways to actually be able to hope to make progress on them. So that's definitely a huge development at the UN.
Hi. I'm curious if you could comment a little bit more on sort of the role of the global compact as compared to some of the various private standards or firm-led standards, you know, in transnational regulation and governance around labor safety, you know, in particular, right, competing standards in Bangladesh, but also in other issues in sort of bankruptcies, and where you see the global compact kind of situating itself moving forward, given that firms are sort of acting on their own in different ways.
Yeah, then there's definitely lots of different layers. I mean, you have the international law, you've got domestic law, you have, as you say, there's all these multi-stakeholder initiatives, and there's definitely a lot going on, and probably more than ever before. So I think in that context, it's ever more important that companies have some kind of roadmap, like some core principles that they basically endorse and that they agree to report on. And then that helps them identify, among other things, from these other different things that are out there, beyond, of course, law, which they must comply with, what makes most sense for them. And in particular, where things are voluntary, we encourage companies to take a very strategic approach and to look at where which is most relevant to their business. So for instance, in companies and sectors where they have high risks of complicity, we're seeing a growth of initiatives where they are collaborating to work on the risks of complicity that come up. So for instance, the Global Network Initiative around ICT companies, or, you know, this goes a bit further back, but you know, the Kimberley process on diamonds, and so other such initiatives like that. I think we'll also see more of those as companies realise there's a pre-competitive interest in collaboration, with companies in their own sector.
So when we think about business and human rights, I think it's quite easy to see how business can improve economic, social rights, right? Like you provided health, employment, higher wages, all of that. How do you see business positively impacting civil and political rights?
Sure. Well, some examples, for instance, on the advocacy side in this country, right? Like when there were some laws that were passed about who can use which bathrooms or whatever, and then you have companies taking a stand, speaking out against it, or in the context, say, of like the Olympics in Sochi, like a number of companies kind of came out in that kind of context and made statements that were critical of the human rights stance that had been taken. So that's, I think, one really key way in which, those are civil and political rights. There's another whole area which is we're looking at the moment, and it's around the role of companies and civil society, and including human rights defenders. Because one of the things we see in many countries around the world is there's kind of, sometimes in the name of concerns about terrorism or security, kind of crackdowns on civil society, and the space for civil society in some cases is narrowing and being constricted. And that might take the form of really difficult registration requirements or restrictions on where they get their funding, and a whole lot of other things like that. And I think one of the other things that, and the way we're kind of talking about this is, coming back to these sustainable development goals, they're really calling for this new forms of collaboration. So even looked at from an instrumental perspective for companies, it just makes sense that civil society, have the space to operate, including on key issues of like rule of law and civil and political rights. And I think that business can be a voice, a supportive voice actually, to help keep that space open. Because we definitely see it's quite worrying actually how there's this restriction. So I think in particular in the advocacy route, but even through philanthropy, a number of companies, like for instance, I think is it Avon? They do work, for instance, on violence against women. There are other companies who fund law schools, anti-violence programs. So that there's definitely things companies can do across pretty much all human rights.
So just to kind of pick up on David's point about how many goals there are within the Sustainable Development Goals, I was looking at them and just thinking about where climate action fits in to the rest. You've got poverty, alleviation, hunger, economic growth, right? Now obviously those goals would be a lot easier to achieve if we were to just burn as much fossil fuel as we wanted to achieve them, right? So these goals don't all necessarily fit comfortably together, right? And if you're looking at like sub-Saharan Africa, right, which goal you work on, right, should really be a function of what the biggest problems are in that place, right? And so if you just say, I'm going to work towards the achievement of the development goals in sub-Saharan Africa, well, here's climate action, that's one, but to do that, that's the wrong one in that region, right? So are there trade-offs like that you guys have to kind of think about?
Absolutely. I mean, another one would be, for instance, say gender equality. Like you could pick other ones, and if you're not thinking about, say, gender equality, you might actually worsen gender equality, right? So this is why it's interdependent. Another reason why the goals are interdependent. And I think there is a tendency, because they're goals, to kind of pick your goal, and once people are taking pictures with their goal. But to your point, one has to think about the interconnections, because it's not a given that just any mechanism or method to advance a goal is actually going to be helpful in advancing other goals. And in fact, as you point out, there's lots of instances where that will have the opposite effect.
I have just one last question. Recently, the ICC prosecutor announced that environmental crimes will be defined as crimes against humanity and as a tool of war. And there's a whole new jurisdiction for the ICC. So there's this sense of like creeping jurisdiction, right? The ICC is growing its ambit of what they consider crimes against humanity or crimes of war. And so do you think that there might come a time when the Global Compact might be also involved with the ICC on prosecuting crimes against humanity in terms of, crimes that businesses might be alleged to have committed?
I don't think that would be something the Global Compact specifically would do, because obviously, there's so many different entities who have their own kind of angle on these things. But I definitely think that, it was one of the things that John Runge pointed out on these guiding principles, that there was this key gap on gross human rights abuses, and he felt this needed to be closed. And maybe, as many of you here know, that the International Criminal Court Rome Statute is specifically for individuals. It doesn't allow legal persons, and it had been discussed at the time and rejected. So, one possibility is, in due course, maybe that would be expanded and enable companies to be brought there. But a curious story from over 10 years ago now, but I remember at the time the chief prosecutor of the ICC made some statement which suggested that maybe he was concerned about resource exploitation in Democratic Republic of Congo, and he made some statements suggesting that he was going to kind of look into this. And he was invited to a conference shortly after, and people were like, "Oh, I wonder what he's going to say. Is he going to scare the companies?" But what he had, the first message that he led with, which really took everyone by surprise, when he was asked, what should companies do, he said they should employ former child soldiers so that they aren't going to. So we just were like, "Oh, okay." So it was interesting, but. At the moment, and of course there's this treaty process, business and human rights treaties in development probably will take 10 years or so to see what comes of it, but that could potentially also close some of these gaps. But it's still a persistent gap that there's not somewhere at the international level really where you could, in the International Criminal Court, for instance, bring a company who'd been involved in gross human rights abuses.
Well, thank you so very much, Ursula.
Thank you so much for having me.
You came to Penn Law to share your knowledge and your wisdom and the wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the good questions, all of you.